Welcome everyone to our third unit, and now I'm going to introduce you to a new way of calculating the GDP, which is the real GDP. We know now that the GDP can be calculated using the different sources of expenditure, C, I, G, X minus M. Let's dig deeper into the details. How do we calculate the consumption or investment or government purchase or exports or imports? Simply by multiplying quantity times the price. So let us assume this country spend their money, or their expenditure will be over 1,000 kilos of apple. The price of each kilo is $10. They also spend their money over haircuts, 2,000 haircuts at the price of $8. So the total will be $10,000 in apples and 16,000 in haircuts, and the total GDP will be 26,000. Usually on the ground, when we calculate GDP, we use both the quantities and the prices of production. Now let's take a look on another example. Here we are comparing the GDP between year 2019 and 2020. Still we're talking about apples and haircuts, and we have the GDP in 2019 at the value of 24,000. In 2020, we found out that the GDP has increased to 32,000. I know that more GDP means more economic development, but if I take a look over these numbers, I will see that the GDP actually has increased, but the increase wasn't because the increase in the quantity produced. It was because the increase in prices. So GDP actually here increase is not due to the increase of my production. It is due to the increase in the prices. And this actually is not representing an economic advancement. So I need to isolate the change only in the quantity and to take out the change in the prices. And here comes the real GDP. When we talk about the real GDP, we are talking about the production in a given year or a given quarter valued at constant prices. In order to get rid of the problem of the change in prices, I'm going to use one period and I'm going to call it the base year. And this year and this base year, I'm going to use its prices to evaluate the production in the preceding years. So let's see. Here is an example. We are comparing this country between 2000 and 2003. We can see that they have spent their money over bulls and bats. In 2000, they actually spent their money over 100 bull and 20 bats. In 2003, it's 160 bull and 22 bats. However, prices actually varies between the 2 years. In 2000, a bull was for $1, a bat was for $5. In 2003, it was 50 cents for a bull and $22.5 for each bat. So I want to calculate first, I want to calculate the nominal GDP. This is the one that we have been introduced to so far. I'm going to multiply the current quantities times the current prices. So for year 2000, it will be 100 times 1 equal 100, 20 times 5 equal 100, and the total GDP will be the summation 100 plus 100 equals 200 in nominal GDP. What about in 2003? I'm going to use the current prices of 2003 and the current quantities of 2003. So it's 160 times 0.5, it will equal 80, and 22 times 22.5, it will equal 495, and the total is 575. So what we have done here, that we have calculated the nominal GDP. We still have the problem of the changing prices. So now I'm going to assume that 2000 is the base year, and I'm going to use the prices of 2000 to evaluate 2003 quantities. So what I'm going to do now is 160 times 1 will equal a total of 160, and 22 times 5 will equal 110, and the real GDP now is 270. If we compared the two numbers, the nominal GDP was 575 and the real was 270. What happened here, that the GDP went down to its real value after extracting the effect of the prices. So the real GDP is actually the current quantities times the base year prices. Now I can use both the nominal GDP and the real GDP to come out with another indicator, this time for the price level, the change in prices. I would like to remind you that our second question in macroeconomics was what determines the cost of living. So this indicator is one of the way that we define this question answer. What determines the cost of living? How does the prices change? So how do we calculate the deflator? It's simply a ratio between the nominal GDP and the real GDP times 100. So let's take an example. Using the same numbers that we just used, we can find out that the GDP for year 2000 equals 200, nominal GDP for 2000, over 200, real GDP for 2000 times 100, it is 100. Question is, why it is 100? Because this is the base period. It's usually 100 for the base period. What about the current period, 2003? The deflator will be the nominal GDP at 575 over the real GDP of 2070, and the deflator equals 230%. What does this mean? It means that the prices in the current period is about 2 times third more, or 2 times and third of the prices of the base period. So if something worth £1 in 2000, it will actually worth £2 30 piastres in 2003. This is the end of our unit, and next we're gonna talk about measuring economic growth. See you then.